really
on,
monetize these things.
Monetize Irish, Sean. My life still hasn't even turned itself on. I'll come back to it in a
But
second.
there's like what 30-second
Oh no,
delay
there
or
we go.
something.
Yeah, mine hasn't come on
Weapons and
yet.
armor. My one just turned on.
Torch has come on.
Yeah, I was gonna say mine's just turned on as well. So I don't even know. Right, so you go to live, do you, and then click the three bars, or
I have to go to context. And do you know
Channel
what?
content
Let's give it Irish ring sword.
Hi Dennis.
And we'll go over and click alert.
I think we're all okay.
1 second. No, I'm not okay until I'm paid. What is it called? Large. Yeah, we'll just chuck this in for the crack. Save image.
my internet is
And
so bad tonight.
Hi Kat.
doesn't seem so bad on my side.
This is main here. Hi, Kat. Hi, Dennis.
How the boys? How's Dennis? Doing well tonight? Okay, well, I think I'm monetized now anyway. That means I'm being paid. Oh, it's still saving. Okay, right. I'll get back to that in a second. Bam, 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 bam. Bam, 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 bam. Hey, Owen. Not sure your sound is great. I think
Yeah, I can hear you.
Owen's...
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear Owen's sound. It's not the greatest right now, but it's grand. I can hear him. That's the main thing. Good day. How's Jim, boy?
Right.
Sandra, how's the boys? How's everyone doing? How's SPCM? Adam, Slancha.
I wonder if the new update is lets us add TikTok to the chat.
TikTok to the chat. Yeah, that'd be good, wouldn't it? To save you from bouncing around the place.
TikTok doesn't allow editing when live. Well, okay, we'll try another time.
Are you live? Are you live on the old Tickety Talk?
I think so. I really should go in there and
I'll check the old
check.
All the
I'm trying
comments
to
you're getting, just ignoring
limit
it.
how many things. I know.
Yeah, more people complaining about Jim O'Neill. What was it called? I said I was going to blame Jim O'Neill there. Owen O'Neill's what was it called? Sound. It's like going in and out. Yeah, it's not the best tonight. But I said the way. What's that? Yeah,
It's not been saying
even when he's
anything.
not saying anything, it's just diabolical. Absolutely dreadful. What was I going to fucking say there? I was going to say something. I can't remember. It mustn't be important, so it's slowly popping out my head. Right, boys. We said we were going to talk about weapons tonight. We'll probably start that conversation since bloody hell it will take a year and a half to talk about the old weapons of the medieval period. It's funny because the medieval period in Ireland, as we go into what was it called, the 5th century, it's a bit funny and it's still under a lot of investigation because of the fact that we don't start off with the classic Celtic age weaponry. It's kind of the Hiberno-Norman weapons that we find in Ireland dated around that time, which hurts a lot of people's feelings. I remember for a very long time, the academic world was kind of in a not accepting. They wouldn't accept these Hiberno-Roman finds in Ireland because they really were counting on more of a Celtic Ireland, during the 19th and a good chunk all the way up to the allegedly all the way up to the 80s and 90s, a lot of the academic world was kind of really, really trying to ignore this kind of Hiberno-Roman finds that they were finding in Ireland. And so when we start off our field of weapons and armor, what you find typically is the classic Roman swords found in Ireland around the early 5th century. Remembering that this is the era when we're going in and we're capturing St. Patrick and bringing him back to Ireland. So there's actually many ways that these weapons and swords and armor, we don't actually have any armor finds yet, but one can imagine what they are, especially from literature from the 11th century, which is very, 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 very debatable. Plus, there's weapons and armors found in Britain, which also make it very, increases the debate still further. One of which I'm talking about is scale armor, which is like scale armor, is very, very, very debated. If it existed, never mind being existing in Ireland. So they have found bits from the 5th century Britain. They have found bits of scale armor in Britain. And then in Ireland, it seems to pop up in the literature in the 12th century. So it is very, very debated if scale armor was in Ireland at the time. Now, in saying that, what's massively influencing Ireland at the time is trade with Britain and the wider Roman world, raiding into Britain at the time because you're dealing with the fall of Rome, especially after 410. And also on top of that as well, we do have Irish that served in the Roman military and may have brought back not just the tactics of the Roman Empire, but also weaponry from the Roman Empire as well. So as we're doing more archaeological work inside of Ireland and we're finding more Hiberno-Roman finds, it seems to support that Ireland in the 5th century wasn't isolated, and it wasn't the, what we refer to in the academic world, the Insula Latin finds. Most of you guys who are into more of the pop history side of things would be referring to as the Celtic finds. So that whole idea of a Celtic Ireland in the 5th century, it's not really a thing when it comes down to the 5th century. It's more Hiberno-Roman finds. You're dealing with the era of St. Patrick just before we go into the golden age of Ireland between 550 up to 793. What kind of thoughts do you guys have when it comes down to weaponry and warfare in the 5th and early 6th century?
Miho ran away. I'll go.
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, I had the good fortune and I went to this museum, and they had that wonderful exhibition in the museum on Romans, on the Roman actually. It's great stuff. But what really struck me is how little actual material, armor and arms there are. There was a shield there, which I think is the only shield that exists. There were some bits of armor, which is some of the only stuff they have. And if you look at thousands of Roman soldiers were in all parts of the empire and the borders and the frontiers, etc., over between the 3rd century or 4th century BC and the 3rd or 4th century AD. Hundreds of thousands, little. Yeah. That material has survived. It's no wonder that we nothing happened in Ireland. But at the same time, I have no doubt that Roman arms and armor came into Ireland. Arms pulled out, like they've discovered recently, garrisons of sort of semi-Roman, Roman descendant auxiliaries big garrison Hadrian's Wall. So armed swords and armor and tacking to Scotland, coming to Ireland, there must have been a huge intersection.
Yeah, I mean, Coroticus had two Irish princes with him in Galloway, with the intention of invading Ireland. This would have come, and we found silver hoards that we suspect had something to do with maybe
not Coroticus, Agricola.
Oh, Agricola. Sorry, yes, sorry.
Agricola, not Coroticus.
Yes.
Coroticus was the leader.
The leader of the war band under. Sorry, but yes, Agricola. Sorry, they're Latin names, and we had a Roman guy. Anyway, but it was Agricola. You are right. And obviously, he had plans to invade Ireland. Possibly, he had two Ulster princes with him. I believe this is then like mixed into our mythology with Tuatha Techmer, like High King of Ireland around at this time. Anyway, we find silver hoards that are connected possibly to this time period and may have been speculated to have been part of the payments that would have been given to these Irish princes for their support. But we have to remember that the Romans didn't just pay in silver. They, especially if they wanted to cause an insurrection or wanted military support, they would also pay in weaponry. So there's no, and that obviously we have, like both of you stated, we have no actual evidence of this, but given off normal standard Roman practice, there was, if they were looking to cause any sort of upheaval or intent to help have their allies involved in an upcoming warfare, armaments or trading of technologies or large silver deposits would have all been normal practice within the Roman Empire this time.
For sure. Hello, everybody coming in here. We're just discussing weapons and armor during the medieval period in Ireland. So if you guys have any questions on weapons and armor, definitely comment below. Jim O'Neill saying, I always had the impression that the English disarmed the Irish and let them have sticks and rocks. It's there where there's fire, there's always smoke. And during the medieval period, the English don't disarm the Irish. But on saying that, there is a period around the 17th century. Jim O'Neill can go into more detail than I can. But there is a period, isn't there, Jim, in the 17th to 18th century where the British do pass a bill. Now, this isn't the medieval period. It's way over in the early modern period where there is a bill passed. Because I do know somebody, he's up around our area, Owen, where he came back home. Didn't he serve in the French or German military? I'm sure it was the French military. And he came back and he was armed and he had a horse. And the English noble in that area, took his horse away from him or something, and there was a bit of a scuffle, and he ends up getting killed because he wasn't supposed to have a weapon and a horse on him.
Yeah, that is by marriage of Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell's aunt, whose name is, she wrote this very long poem about this guy. I can't remember his name. He was in the Austrian army, but one of Daniel O'Connell's uncles, he was the last commander of this brigade in the French army. There was a huge amount of coming and going. Like the peasantry, etc., wouldn't at that stage. Some nobility, there weren't many Catholic nobility. They would have swords, but they would have had not. Like they weren't supposed to have a good horse. And this was killed because he had a series of run-ins with the of Cork, and didn't sell his horse or something. There was they
Yeah.
were killed. I it's annoying me that poem,
No,
but I can't remember it.
I can't. Yeah, because it's the you weren't a Catholic wasn't allowed to own a horse worth more than £5,
Yeah.
and I believe the part of that is that any Protestant like offering the sum could legally seize that Catholic's horse,
Mm.
if they if they were offering the amount that it was worth. But yeah, I'm not aware of any specific laws in the medieval period that are causing the sort of disarmament of the native Irish in a specific context, beyond obviously after a battle or siege or where mostly it sort of happens, like I said, in the 17th century. That's
Mm.
and you've got the penal laws. You've got the 1695. There's an act, but basically it just stops like Catholics. They're not allowed to carry. They're not allowed to carry firearms, swords, possess any other
Mm.
weapon. So, but obviously, a lot of this comes back from the earlier Cromwellian era. And the 1641 rebellion, where mass amounts of soldiers were disarmed.
Mm.
Um, um, But yeah, the only thing I'd have to reread the Statutes of Kilkenny, because whenever I've read the
It's not in
1366,
there.
I was going to say, because the only time I've ever read it, I've
Yeah.
only been
No,
interested in the naming side. What about the
yeah.
1466 Act?
It was
1466.
the,
Sorry, Owen.
Go on.
just come back there. It was Queen of Ireland by Evelyn Doug
Mm.
Connell. So the Art O'Leary, he was killed. Um,
Mm.
the before 1607, the Gaelic, there was no disarming because essentially
Mm.
Gaelic Ireland was separate. It was autonomous. All
Yeah.
lords had their military followers,
Mhm.
and men and most people would harm somehow because even if they were loyal, they could join the English army. The rising up or the rising out, sort of
Mm.
militias. It was a very militarized society. The general peasantry on the 1960s wouldn't have taken. Shane O'Neill then began to arm the peasants to the annoyance of the English, and Hugh O'Neill did it on a much bigger scale. He began to pay properly. We have a proclamation of his about how he organized. But before that, throughout the medieval period, all lords, whether they had armed followers. It was part of being a lord. And
Yeah.
the same in France. It was a big difficulty for every European state to disarm these people and to control these people. In France, it only really comes in the 17th century after the Fronde Rising.
Mm.
So the English, in that the Wars of the Roses killed so many nobles that the Tudors were able to sort of get a control. But then the Civil War, etc., makes things more complicated.
Yeah. Just sorry, Helen. What part of Ireland did the Romans conquer? No, the Romans never conquered any part of Ireland, and there was the plans to, but they never came to fruition. Yeah, I also when we talk about disarmament, like I said, sort of before about sieges and castles, we got to be kind of um, like, are people asking for like a nationwide or just in because obviously whenever the 1641 rebellion sort of came off, I know the authorities were like really quickly going around and saying, look, you have to return the arms that have been previously issued to Catholic palesmen, and the official orders were given out that papists should be disarmed, but that was only within the Pale nobility. It wasn't
Mm.
extended to the wider to Ireland. And then obviously in 1652, after that, the Cromwellian period, they the issue that everyone's got 28 days to um, return, to hand in their arms. But
Mm.
again, that I think that has something to do with more like combatants than rather than just every single person on the island of Ireland has to sort of return their arms. So there's these like little waves of like disarmament, but not as a general rule until, like I say, until the probably the 1695 um, Parliament Act. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you because subjugation of the medieval period, you were expected then, if you were to give military service to anyone, let it be the English or another Gaelic lord or even an old French lord, if you were to give military, being a retinue or a levy of some sort, you were expected to rock up with your own weapon and armor. So it would be silly for them to disarm you and then suddenly expect you to be armed again, the following day. Regardless, there's a good question that would bring us back over to the very start of the early medieval period again, from Davy Jones, who asks, heard after a battle, swords, weapons were thrown in a lake or bent over. Is this true? Slightly different. First and foremost, weapons weren't destroyed after a battle. You do have signs that are there, once a weapon is starting to fall apart after years and years of service, you do have indications from, in, what was it, Latin culture in the continent, of swords being bent and then thrown into a river. Because it's believed from Celtic culture, allegedly, that swords had a soul. So there's an idea then from that before burial is that you bend it over and you chuck it into the river. And I'm sure there's finds all the way up to the Viking Age from the Scandinavians as well that kind of believed in the same mythology of this. I could be easily mistaken about it, but regardless, I'm sure there is finds as well of swords being bent and chucked into a river from the Vikings. So there is this kind of belief of
No, I think
a sword having soul. Go
I
on.
I think the swords and the deposit of them. Archaeologists say deposit as opposed
Mm.
to chucking. What the difference? I don't know. I think in Ireland it's more
Yeah.
Iron Age. It's
Mm.
yeah,
pre-Christian.
Yeah.
Lots of swords found in Ireland, England, etc. in former wetlands or rivers.
Mm.
Some would have been dropped.
Yeah.
Others seem to have been ritualistically.
Mm.
Not all swords were bent. If you go, for example, if you
Yeah.
go to the museum in Kildare, they
Mm.
impressive, um, very impressive swords from bronze swords, which I think
mm,
survive better in Irish conditions than Iron Age swords. None of those seem
Yeah, they
to have
do.
been bent. And there
Mm.
are some, they found some, most of those are not very well preserved.
Mm.
yeah. Our landscape doesn't lend well to um, preserving of archaeological evidence from the Iron Age for some reason.
Yeah, it's mostly sadly about bogs and stuff as well. It's because I'm always yapping on about the importance of going through the old bog to find anything really important because bog bodies and everything so good in Ireland, especially during the medieval period when it comes down to preserving a lot of this stuff that we know today. It's interesting as well because um, we start to go into the Christian period, just between, what was it, 410 to 550. There's, you've got the likes of Palladius who comes in, then you have St. Patrick, and then between, what was it called, 550 to 793, you do have burial. People are now starting to get buried. But sadly, because, as Mihal, and it's a really good point to point out, um, before that, you would have had the likes of kings and stuff that were chucked into the bog. By the time you get up to around 550 to 793, other than Donncha Dunn, who did have a ritual sacrifice of a debt, there seems to be more or less Christian burials starting to appear in Ireland, especially when Donncha Dunn is kind of the last pagan king of Ireland. And then after that point, you go into a point of, kings and nobles and all that stuff being buried. The problem is with that is the acidic that's in the ground. You can even get that when you're going into the Viking Age, where you get little evidence. When you do find the Viking burial, we're dealing with very, very little. And if we do find anything, very, very delicate. Like the people who have to unearth this from the ground, and this is why I'm really against metal detectors inside of Ireland. When you do find anything, the only people being able to lift or get any evidence out is insanely trained archaeologists with a lot of years of experience, as Owen will highlight there as well. Because the ground itself, especially with being so acidic, if anything is found, is so delicate. So anything we are working with between 550 up to the entirety of the medieval period, even up to around 1603, very delicate work. Would you not agree with that, Owen?
Yeah, and I would say, just to make things worse, Ireland, Dublin had they found a huge Viking cemetery with a large amount of military. It was found in the 19th century in Island Bridge when they were building Houston Station. Some of them saved, but if they had found that 100 years later, we would know so about it, because apparently it would have been Viking graveyards, and I think a lot of the iron was better preserved there than it normally is. Another thing there, in Iron Age Ireland, and in Bronze Age, cremation was very common. And sometimes grave goods were buried, sometimes not. When Christianity came, one of the big beliefs, and especially in Christianity, was resurrection. And people believed that was what was going to happen within a short period. So therefore, Christians were buried, like you cremation. Christians didn't like cremation. And Irish Catholic Church has only permitted cremation in the last decades.
No.
But so cremation stops, but they're not buried with grave goods. So like if you go to Scandinavia, if you go to from Europe and Central Europe, they found, when they find burial, they'll find loads and loads and loads of goods. You find a Christian burial, because go into any big monastery in continental Europe and you'll find an effigy where you had king this or king that, or knight this or knight. But if you open those up, goods. You won't find grave goods. Just find like bones, if even. In the city, there is St. Michael's Church, and it had a catacomb which mummified naturally the bodies. And as a kid, I went in there, and there was two of them were crusaders where they're buried, but somebody had tried to set them on fire. Actually, did set them on fire last year or the year before.
So you get that poor grave got decapitated and everything, like
stick fighting.
Well, stick fighting definitely wasn't a thing during the medieval period.
It's basically 19th century, maybe 18th century. There was written about 40 years ago on action fight. He dates it to the 1820s, 1830s in Tipperary. It's not. I know some of the people pushing stick fighting say, "Oh, it's descended from the current." It's not. It's something new. Like, well, it's back to the 19th century. Nothing before that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a Doyle one apparently. If you go on the Clan Doyle website, it's called Whiskey Stick Dancing, and it was invented by the Doyle clan.
Mm.
This is obviously there for being from their website, not actual historicity, but yeah, which I always thought it was a bit interesting. Like that, it just seemed to encompass all the tropes about Irishness. You know, whiskey, fighting, you know, clans. So it's
Where are we from? We're from Manchester. We're all from Manchester, England.
no.
Uh,
Owen's from Owen's from Kerry. I'm from Ulster, and Philip's from a backwater part of the island that's not really worth talking about.
he's lying. We're all from Manchester, England. I don't know what you're talking about. Do you not like my Manchester accent? No. What was it called? Dennis, you were saying that it was harder to comment early on. Are you still having problems with that one, Dennis? If you guys are finding this one difficult, definitely comment below because I know Rachel's having huge problems with this new update as well. She doesn't like it at all. What was it called? There was also something else as well. Yeah, grave goods in the early medieval period is funny because even when we go up to the early medieval period, then so how we're cutting it down is that you have the early medieval period is broken down into Hiberno-Roman finds, as we were discussing there. You know, you're dealing with the age of St. Patrick, so we're having trade between the Roman Britons. We're going in and raiding Roman Britain, and we also have Irish are doing military service with Roman Britain. So that's bringing weapons and armor into Ireland at the time. We're also having Smiths then that are adapting that one. So it has its own style, which is Hiberno-Roman. Okay, then we go from that into the golden age of Ireland between 550 to 793, and that kind of continues the influences from the continent over to Ireland. So by the time we get up to the Viking Age, although people have this romantic idea of a bunch of naked Celts ready to fight ready to fight the Vikings, and the Vikings coming in and bringing in 200 years of Viking occupation. That's not the truth whatsoever because of the trade that was happening between Ireland and Britain. Remember, this is the golden age of Ireland. Irish monks and clergy have been going into Europe. So at the time, Ireland has an amazing relationship with Europe and especially Charlemagne's court at the time. So during the golden age of Ireland, between 550 to 793, you do find, even finds from the Byzantine Empire coming into Ireland at the time. So one of the biggest traders into Ireland, and we even had Colin on the channel discussing this, but one of the key what was it called? Academics is Professor Aidan O'Sullivan of Maynooth University, who's done an entire paper on this one, and that would be what they were used to refer to as Celtic Charlemagne finds in Ireland. These days they call it Hiberno-Frankish finds in Ireland, between I suppose it's the 7th century up to 793, so 600 AD up to 793. And you're finding a lot of Frankish finds in Ireland. Obviously, once again, massively influenced with the Irish finds in Ireland. So when the Vikings do appear into Ireland, they're not facing against a very weak Irish. This is a very well disciplined military force with the latest weapons from Charlemagne's court. On top of that, as well, this explains when Turgis does come in to invade Ireland around the 840s. He's beaten. Turgis is beaten by Muir Shocknall the First. Okay, so everybody has this idea of the Vikings easily coming in, overwhelming these naked Irish who could barely, be able to afford a sword, never mind by a riveted mail. And yet that's not the reality. When Turgis invades into Ireland, he's easily overwhelmed and beaten by Muir Shocknall the First. Now, don't get me wrong, the Vikings are very successful when it comes down to raiding. Sure, didn't they mess up the coastal areas of Ireland? But when it comes down to battles in Ireland, you'd be very, it's very difficult to find battles that the Vikings were successful in. And when you do find battles that the Vikings are successful in, you always find it was from the Gaul Gael, the foreign Irish. The Irish Vikings, as some people would refer to them as the modern interpretation. So when it comes down to the men of Luckland, the men from Norway, it's very difficult for them to go in there and successfully win battles against the Irish. And that's down to the fact that this is not a backwards Ireland when the Vikings do come into Ireland at the time. Is there any other things of note that I should bring up as well, lads, when it comes down to weapons and armor of the Viking Age?
You're welcome, Dennis. By the way, just I was playing around with the settings there while we were live, and it seems to have
Yeah, it's
fixed
much
the
better.
screen. That's all right then. And Fagatrola, they bring in the 13-ton Hitachi. Is that massive sword in Japan? I'm guessing that huge. Yeah, I mean that would have done the job. I'm just trying to. Well, obviously, Kat has asked us before, and I think it's fair if we're talking about the Viking Age. Maybe then we can touch on women within warfare of Ireland. And I know that there's been a large sort of slathering across social media about shield maidens, and stuff like that. Would we? The only one I'm aware of in Ireland is the Red Maiden in Ulster, who may be. I think most historians consider her fictional now, but she's mentioned by McFirbis. And I know there's two graves in Ireland, in Ulster, one in Ballyholme and one near on the River Bann, that they found of females within sort of like the 9th century. So, what is your interpretation of shield maidens and Ireland?
I would say in Gaelic Ireland, there was very little female participation.
Yeah.
Or is it Sean McCool? In one of the
It's Cucullum. Yeah.
Yes.
This etc. High rank.
Oh, Owen's given up. We'll see if he returns. But yeah, I completely agree with what Dr. Owen O'Neill is saying there. The thing that kind of hangs over the head just going into the Viking Age is there probably was, during the Golden Age of Ireland and before then, there may have been female combatants just because before then we have laws preventing women from going onto the battlefield. Now, the fact that we have laws brought in to prevent women from going onto the battlefield is a good indication that there may have been women on the battlefield. And that would be the Law of the Innocents in 697 AD. At the Synod of Birr, they bring in a law preventing female combatants on the battlefield. Now, remember, that's a period where you see one or two major battles between the Anglo-Saxons and the Gaelic of Ireland. But for the most part, you're dealing with a cattle raiding society, okay? So there may have been, the Celtic female warriors involved in cattle raiding in Ireland. However, going into the Viking Age, there is increasing laws, not just to prevent women from going onto the battlefield, but also to protect women when going outside of the ring forts. Why is there increasing laws to protect women going into the Viking Age? Well, because pirates, both Gaul Gael, foreign Irish Vikings, and the men of Luckland, Norwegians, are physically picking up women and running away with them. And people have an idea that this is only happening in Ireland. No, no, this is happening in Scandinavia. This is happening in the Anglo-Saxon territories. And so there is increasing laws to protect women when going outside of your ring fort. This goes as far as basically pointing out that it's not just mandatory for you to go outside your tuat with a man, let it be your husband or your founder, but also, or a male protector, full stop, but also for them to be armed. Because of the threat of Viking raiders, pirates, just picking up women and running away with them was so high. Now, on saying that, as you guys have pointed out as well, we have literature that romanticizes the idea of women going out there and committing piracy themselves. Now, in saying that, even when we go up to the pirate age of the 17th century, we have female pirates. In fact, like Ireland kicks off the pirate age with Grace O'Malley. So even from the get-go, we have female pirates in Ireland. So going into the Viking Age, is it possible that we have female Vikings? It's in the realm of possibility. However, at the same time, looking at laws and the reflection of it, it seems to highlight the fact that women were targets during the Viking Age. So women are put more under the protection. Were large amounts of Irish women taken as captives to Iceland. There is evidence of women being taken as slaves. There's no evidence of this big, massive, large amount of women suddenly being captured and taken off to Iceland. Most of these, the DNA that they're found today, like first and foremost, the argument that was made recently comes from the story of Olaf the Peacock. But the story itself, although Icelanders are trying to make out that this is proof that large amount of women were taken from Ireland and brought over to Iceland, the story only talks about one noble woman who was taken by accident. So on top of that, not only is it just one woman, but ends up she was taken by accident. Being a noble woman, she should have never been taken, according to the story itself, and that's Olaf the Peacock. That talks about a Gaul Gael, an Irish Viking.
Yeah,
So,
there's also
go on.
they're also finding genetic markers that some Icelandic families carry male Irish haplogroups. So it's not just a case of, we know the slave trade existed in Ireland. We
Yeah.
know it was connected to Iceland. So it's a fair assumption that slaves would have made it across there. But I kind of feel like this narrative of all the women were taken to it carries along the joke online that you see all these beautiful, why Icelandics are beautiful is because they have these beautiful Norse husbands and these beautiful Irish women, and and it seems a bit
It's some strange fetish, to be honest with you. Like,
yeah.
don't get me wrong, Icelanders seem to bring it up, but they always talk in a very fetishized way. And I never see any sources for it. There is no, like, the only major battle that, if you're looking at this Norway versus Ireland thing, the only major battle that the Irish lose, and they don't lose to Norway in this battle, is the Battle of Isle Bridge, which is fought between the men of Dublin and the men of the Northern Inel against Niall Glundov. But the thing is, and this needs to be highlighted, is the people they lose to is not Norway. They don't lose to Iceland. They lose to the men of Dublin. And at the time, these were not Scandinavian Vikings. These are Gaul Gael. These are foreign Irish, as they're referred to. And at the time, but even the nobility that were living in Dublin were heavily related to the various families of Leinster and the Enel, and that was the Evers, the descendants of Ivor the Boneless. They had been living in Ireland since around 860. So by the time you get up to the Battle of, the Battle of Isle Bridge, fought around 919, Um, they're not dealing. You're not dealing with Norwegians anymore. You're not dealing with Icelanders. These are the men of Dublin. So people who were captured after the Battle of Bridge, if anyone was taken, would have been taken to Dublin. Now they could have been sold on after that. But there isn't. It's not a foreign group not a foreign group going in and taking a whole load of Irish people and bringing them back to Dublin after the battle. Other than that, I can't think of another single example of Vikings doing massive amount of damage that would have resulted to a massive amount of slaves being taken off to some foreign land. Most of the time, they were taken to Dublin. On top of that, as well, what you're seeing more of in Ireland instead of a massive amount of women, and don't get me wrong, there is women being taken and sold in Dublin. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but if you actually read the sources, especially the Icelandic sagas actually outright tell you who they are related to. And they're not related to these people through slavery. They're related to these people through marriage alliances. And in Iceland, these marriage alliances are linked right into, many of them, into the Enel and also the Leinster dynasties. And they're very proud of this lineage, not turning around and saying, oh, the Irish are subhuman or they're sub this. No, no, no. They're turning around and glorifying, hey, look, I'm related to some great kings from this majestic land called Ireland. That's how they're talking in the Icelandic sagas. They're not undermining any of these marriage alliances. They're very proud of their Irish marriage alliances. So I do
We've
find
also
it
got to
strange today. Go on.
we've also got to remember. I think the focusing on the female slaves. Now, like I
Mm,
said, we have the male. We know male slaves as well, and we know that some Icelandic families have haplogroups that are male line genetically related to Ireland. So not all of them
mm,
are Norse Vikings. But regardless, we also have to remember that these families are intermarrying, like you say, but when they're intermarrying, what they bring with them is members of their households, members of their own slaves, members of
mm,
their own servants. So they're bringing them in too. Not everyone who is suddenly, if you somehow find a connection to Ireland through a female outside of Ireland from the medieval period, doesn't necessarily mean that this person was a slave. Um, yes, it was rampant. Yes, it was. But I think just focusing on and narrowing it down into almost like I say, goes back into the word you used earlier about fetishizing. I think it just, and it really strips down a layer of complexity around the history of it without,
mm.
um, and simplifying it in a way that I think sometimes can be perceived as uncomfortable. um,
No, on saying that, I'm not turning around and saying that women didn't have, we're starting to build this picture now that women belonged in the kitchen and all they did all day was, serve the men. And that's not the truth either. Maynooth University has gone into deep study recently, and women were, both in Ireland and Scandinavia, were very dominant when it comes down to the administration that was done inside of the settlement. Like if you look at both was on the Deep Minded and Land of Mead around 840 to 860, they're the women who dominate the administration. So where you have the likes of Flann Sinna, we have Mael Shocknell the First, we have Ivor the Bonus, we have Olaf the White, who are very much in charge of the military side of things. When it comes down to the administration, financially, and even the trade that was happening between these areas and the administration of the settlement itself, that's where we see women very much in charge of. And this continues all the way up to the late medieval period and on to the Renaissance until the English start to appear. And it's at that point onwards that we start to see letters appearing, bitching and mourning about how you have these English men that they're now marrying into who are restricting their independence on carrying out their administration of their own land. You do have letters of Irish women, both the Fitzgerald women, the Butler women, and members of the O'Brien bitching that they're feeling very restricted on the way that the Englishmen are treating them when it comes down to doing their administration. So just because women aren't going into battle with these big double-headed axes and stuff, killing 10,000 men, that it doesn't mean that women suddenly are very restricted when it comes down to the medieval period. You see in Ireland, women are very much involved when it comes down to the administration and running of the land. And that's, from servants, as Mihal points out, you've women who are going into marriages, bringing servants with them. And that's also just the way that finances are being ran on the land and stuff. So, we have to take a step back and look at women slightly different to men. Okay, so they're not involved, they're not tied and chained to the kitchen. But at the same time, they're not in the battlefield with two double-handed axes killing 10,000 men. So we have to strike the balance and then look at it from that point onwards. Okay, they're involved with the administration. How does reality, treat them? We do know at the same time they didn't have the freedom when it comes down to the Viking Age of them just wandering off into the middle of nowhere, because they could be physically taken by a pirate, by a Viking raider. We know that by the way the Brehon law has them being protected. And on top of that as well, even the way that story and literature tries to tell highlights the fact that you do have women that are under protection, but at the same time very much involved with the administration.
Yeah,
unless
but
you guys have anything to say differently.
yeah, at the same time, you have to be careful about a woman was inferior to a man legally.
Yeah.
And I see people talk about Brehon law saying, "Oh, Brehon law was feminist. Women were treated so well." That's rubbish. They weren't like sort of. I think there was one type of currency, which was a female slave. A cow was worth 3 female slaves.
Yeah.
Elite women were bargaining, were used for bargaining. So they were bargained off for marriage. So were elite men, but less than women. A woman, as Kat says, it sucked to be a woman back then, in her opinion. Yes, it quite often did. If you were at the very top, you would have had a better time of it. You would have lots of servants. But a woman's role was more difficult. At the same time, certain areas like religion allowed an area of freedom. It's like St. Bridget, women who set up religious settlements. I know in one of the early monastic sites in Kerry, which they excavated, they found a woman's skeleton, which is interesting because normally you think these small monastic settlements just men. This had a woman. So women had an important role, but you have to be very, very careful talking about them. They're definitely in a subordinate position. Were there many female merchants? Probably
In the
not.
it's a difficult one because you do have women involved with the finances.
You would have a woman who was married to a merchant and maybe she became a widow, especially in the later medieval period, and could have run the thing, taken over her husband's business or inherited it.
That one's quite funny. Yeah.
You had a thing called the grey merchants, especially in the later Middle Ages, early modern period, who were sort of old. They were from the towns and stuff, but they would wander into Gaelic areas, and they were a very important means of selling stuff, etc.
When it comes down to merchant women, we do have evidence of Odd the Deep-Minded, and also this is the same period of land of Mead as well, and they seem to be very much involved with the administration of finances that were happening both in Dublin and in Clonmacnoise. So it is a very funny area when it comes down to them being involved with the finances and economics. The early medieval period is funny because, when it comes down to being the dominant, because this is the early medieval period is an era of warlords. So it is whoever has the biggest stick is the man who says, it dictates what happens. But at the same time, it seems that most settlements were ran by a lot. There's a lot of women that seem to be, and it seems to be very much us trying to go back over our own history, because even nuns were very much involved with the accountancy. It seems to be when it comes down to accountancy and various paperwork and stuff, that seems to be a woman's job. So, more research is being done into it when it comes down to the finances and stuff. And remember, like, Aid the Deep-Minded was very much dominant into the administration of Dublin in the period of Olaf the White and Ive the Bonus. So when the two of them are campaigning in Dublin, what was it called, Britain and Ireland, and they're away from Dublin, it's Odd the Deep-Minded who's running the show inside of Dublin, and dictating the trade that's happening inside the port. When her husband and Ivor the Bonus are both killed during the fight in Britain and Ireland, she then goes over to Iceland. Now, the thing is, straight away, she has to marry. She goes off, tries to organize herself and her daughters to remarry to another warlord, and goes up to Iceland and opens up ports in Ireland and becomes insanely successful. Once again, very, very successful when it comes down to the finances. And that's because from an early age, she's taught how to run the administration. The thing about women in Ireland throughout the medieval period, elite women, is they're not pretty pictures. They're not there to do the sewing. They're not there to do paintings and stuff at the side. They're taught from a very young age on how to run the administration of a settlement. So it is a complicated area. And then as we go into, even when we go into the High Middle Ages, we have Isabel de Clare, for example, who goes between her settlements in Wales and Ireland, running the administration, while her husband, William Marshall, is away, which once again highlights the fact that even when we go into the High Middle Ages, women are very much involved with the administration of running the settlement. So, to turn around and say, okay, so go on.
Just to interrupt you there, you're talking, say, in the early Middle Ages, you're talking about the towns, Dublin, etc. We don't have that much information about the Gaelic area, which makes it very complicated.
Yeah.
In Gaelic area, most of the administration would have been done through monastic sites. Some of these would have been run by women, such as Kildare. I'm sure that like, I'm a local lord. I want someone to count my money, to tell me generally how things are going. I have papers to store. I'll store them there. If Bridget is there, like, running Kildare very well, she's going to be looking after my stuff. But if you jump the 16th century, there are some very, very interesting Gaelic women. Everyone just talks about Granuaile, and 90% of what they say about her is not true. But you have these two ladies, a mother and a daughter, who are probably some of the most powerful women in 16th century Ireland. They actually came from Scotland. The first was, what was her name? Lady Agnes Campbell. And she married Turlough Linnock O'Neill. And she was responsible for propping him up, because as part of her marriage agreement, she came with a large amount of soldiers. Her daughter, Enine Dove, was the mother of Hugh O'Donnell, nowadays known as Red Hugh O'Donnell. And when Hugh O'Neill busted Red Hugh O'Donnell out of prison and brought him up to Donegal, Enine Dove got her, because through her mother, she had a huge amount, she had military power. There was her forces went into battle. They killed one other claimant, and then Niall Gareth said, "Fine, you can be boss." So they are they're much more powerful than growing your well.
Yeah.
Nobody knows about
Um,
them.
what was it called? Emily
Yeah.
Little, Dr. Emily Little has, she's in the middle of doing research and stuff into this. It was the 16th century as well. And here she covers the differences between Grace O'Malley and Joan Fitzgerald. And it's Joan Fitzgerald is a really interesting character because she has those letters that highlight the major differences between the English men that she now has to marry into and the Irishmen, and how the Englishmen are trying to restrict her running her own administration within her own lands. So as like I definitely agree with Owen O'Neill that it is very, very complicated, especially like you've got one settlement that's run by the likes of Bridget down in Kildare. But then you may have another settlement then, like Clonmacnoise, for example. Okay, so you do have land of Meath that is running administration at one stage. But before that, you'd have the likes of St. Kieran running the administration that's in there. So I wouldn't say it's 100% ran by women for sure. But it is definitely a much more complicated situation than we previously thought, where we would have understood the medieval period previously as just being a full-on male-dictated society. It may have been much more complicated just because we have women running the administration at the time. Unless you guys have anything else to, because Mihal, you seem to want to jump in there as well.
Well, there's a couple of points. One thing I want to just like nip in the bud because I can speak from my personal experience on this one. From Mehdi was talking about, is it possible that women weren't involved in warfare because of such things like, you could get a man could get distracted, break ranks to protect a woman. These sort of thinkings are modern, and it used recently to argue against women joining our current military. As someone who's fought in battle and had women in my sections, I can tell you right now, there was no priority over a woman to a man when the Ryans were coming down towards you. It was you work as a team. It's a collective thing. Women, this is obviously you're going to get individual moments, white knight moments, I'm sure, in history, but the military generally, and I would imagine this goes way back. It certainly goes back to the Roman era. It's very hierarchical outside of the already established hierarchy of rank structure. So you have the rank structure, and then within each rank structure, you have social hierarchies within it. And a woman can fall into any one of them, regardless of, any individual can fall, regardless of sex, gender, age. So I never saw there's no real argument in that sort of way for women to be excluded from the military, even today. But so yeah, I think that that's not the reason why they were excluded. I think part of the reason, I think the reasoning for women being excluded comes from a lot of layering of, whether it be patriarchal sort of rule sets, sort of individuals sort of come into power, they wish to placate and trim away some of the bureaucracy, some of the positions of women, some of the ideals coming from the church. Women are inherently the bringers of sin. So I think these sort of things, but I don't think at any point it just kind of came as a flash. This is layered upon layered upon. It's a slowly erosion of women's rights. Not that they really had any rights to begin with, but why they become worse later on. Now, like I said, there are. So if we're talking about like powerful women, there's a couple of individuals. I think the fact we've kind of gone from the Viking era and to the 16th century, and we've skipped over Gormla, which I'm sure we'll go into at some point. But she's a very powerful figure in the 11th century, 10th century, 10th, 11th century. She sort of straddles that. And then you've got like Dervgol O'Connor as well. I don't know how to pronounce her
Mm.
native Irish name, but she's another one in the 14th century. Um, so yeah, I think, and they're famous, both famous for two totally different things, doing two totally different things. Dervgol kind of bypasses her husband and avenges her brother's murders um, by hiring soldiers to kill um, the lords of another clan, even though her husband had signed a peace treaty with that group. But it had forgiven the murders of his brothers-in-law, but she obviously wasn't happy about that. So and then Gormla's probably famous for marrying, but being very famous kings, and producing very famous sons and being involved in the politics of the time. So I think the fact that these individuals exist and are famous for a multitude of different things shows the wide aspect of which many roles that women could slide themselves into. Um,
Mm.
but none of it was ever easy. But those women that did do it were the exception, not the rule.
Mm.
These are women that were probably just very astute and able to be born in a circumstance that sort of helped them, or had circumstances foisted on them that allowed them to do this. It wasn't something available to every woman.
Well, the thing is warfare is shite. Like the thing is, a lot of people who make the argument about women out on the battlefield and stuff. Why would you want to go rushing off into a meat grinder? You know, I can understand the fun and the banter of having an old cattle raid. That definitely is where the banter's at. But battles, I know they're glorified in the poems and the songs and all that stuff, and that's kind of what great warriors are looking for, is having an epic song, sung about them for the next 1,000 years or so. But the grim reality is that the battlefield was a full-on meat grinder. You went into formation, and then you went against someone else's formation, and the two of you poked and prod each other until the two sides were dead. And then you have these battles tearing up to 120 men pushing against each other, trying to impale each other. Why would any sane human being want to be a part of that? I always find it funny when they go on about, women were part of the battlefield, they were equal to men. Why would anybody want to be a part of that? Any sane human being?
But at the same
Go on.
at the same time, until the mid 19th century, maybe slightly early, any army was followed by a large amount of people, of civilians, many whom were women, the so-called
Yeah,
camp
that's true.
folk.
Yeah.
You get any army marching along, you're going to find there's going to be some women there who are wives or daughters of some of the soldiers. You're going to be women there who are working as servants. You're going to be women there who are working like as craftswomen to fix,
Yeah.
maybe to fix clothing. Women working as cooks. Women working in some sort of medical capacity. At certain stages, nuns, and then other occupations. You always had this, and it wasn't always a very safe place to be, because
Yeah.
the two armies march off and they leave the camps alone, and quite often the camp would get captured or attacked in the battle. And if you're a civilian, whether a man or a woman, and you're in the camp when it gets attacked and is getting plundered, there's a very large chance you're going to end up dead.
Yeah.
Or captured.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. There's definitely camp followers. Like even if you look at what's it called, Finn McCool's tales in, where is it? Kevin Murray's in the Finn Cycle. I have it somewhere in the house. it talks about women in certain areas that the Fenian would go to, and from there, they would go to the various bathhouses and stuff and be looked after by women. So, you go way back into the early medieval period, you have, what we refer to as camp followers, looking after the military, giving these men baths, what was it called, looking after their needs, looking after their kit, sewing. You would also have them looking after whatever they could at the time, and making a couple of bob at the side, because some of these women were just unwanted women. They lived, didn't live the greatest lives. But and even on top of that, you didn't just have women from a poor background. You would have had women, even married women, following their husbands into battle. There's what was it? Rachel was talking about camp followers the other day, and you did have women who were terrified that their husband, wouldn't have enough clothing or various other bits and bobs sorted while they were fighting. So these women would actually come with their husbands into battle. Rachel was talking about this on Friday. So it wasn't just the unwanted women of society that became camp followers. You even had the wives to some of these men following them into the battlefield, not taking part in the battlefield, of course, but following them into battle. If you look at Butakai, for example, although she was a woman and other women had fought in the battles against the Romans when they were going into occupy Britain, Budukai's camp, what was it called? Wagons. Wagons were full of women and children, which highlights again, even in the Roman conquest of Britain around 90 AD, the majority of camp followers at the time were women and children. And once again, looking after all the administration that was happening behind the scenes on the battlefield. And even on top of that, you talk about the High Middle Ages as well, going just after the Viking Age in Britain. And once again, you have women, you have accounts of women looking after, following the men into battle, but not being in the front line. You have noble women go into the battlefield, not taking part in the front line, but what they actually are taking part in, and it ends up being insanely important, is the administration happening in the back. A lot of people assume when organizing a battle that it's just a case of groups of men coming together, poking each other to death, when that's not the case at all. If you're dealing with 10,000 men that need to be rotated, well, even 100 men that need to be rotated in the back, they need fresh, some of their weapons need, some of their armors have nips in it, that needs to be looked after. The weapons are going to start to break down, that needs to be looked after. These men need to have fresh food, they need fresh weapons being brought into the battlefield. These men also need to be watered. Ultimately, and that's even before we get into bedding, stuff needing to be kept clean to stop the spread of diarrhea and vomiting. And so before you know it, the battlefield needs to be organized, even if it is groups of men going in there to butcher each other like cattle. So ultimately, you're going to have people, and a lot of the time, even from the early medieval period going into the High Middle Ages, you even have noble women going in as camp followers to make sure that administration is at a certain high standard, so people aren't, even the fact of the spreading of diarrhea and vomiting. So that's all kept clean and to a certain standard.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said.
The High Middle Ages and the changing of warfare there. Going from the Viking Age into the High Middle Ages, what we have then is massive changes happening in Ireland, even from warfare. Warfare in Ireland during the Viking Age was very much a case of formation versus formation. However, with the coming of the Old French, the Normans, into Ireland after 1169, what we have is a solution to these long and very, very drawn out battles. In the later stage of the Viking Age in 10th century Ireland, what we're seeing is battles that are starting in the very early mornings and going all the way up to the evenings, and even sometimes lasting up to a full month, where shield walls are not breaking down. However, in France, they have found a solution, and that is good stirrups and a good mounted charge into the flanks or even the center of these formations to break it down and then leave gaps in their formation, allowing infantry to go in and start surrounding the enemy and chopping them up. This style of warfare would reach Ireland in 1169 and dominate all the way up to the Scottish War of Independence. The Scots and the O'Neills would eventually find the solution with good pike and spear formations and the usage of hobblers, which would prevent counters from the longbowmen. And then from there, warfare going into late medieval period would start to become much more complicated. Because of this, between the period of 1169, just before the 14th century, warfare, everything to do with warfare, would completely change. And it would definitely become more focused around what we would call in Ireland the Ridra, the Irish Knight. Even inside of Ireland, you would see changes happening, especially after the 14th century, which would divide the Normans, as we refer to, differently in their development to their English and French counterparts. Going into late medieval period, their armour would definitely transform and change. But inside of the High Middle Ages in Ireland, where we're dealing with what was it called? Gothic architecture being introduced into Ireland. We do see much more similarities between the Irish, what was it called, the Knights in Ireland and the English and French counterparts, and we can see that with effigies. The majority of these knights were part of the English administration, giving a slight disadvantage to the Gaelic. However, you do have knights that did either have various forms of alliances with Gaelic lords or just outright had marriage alliances as well. In reality, it is much more complicated going between 1169 up to the early 14th century. Do you guys have anything else to add into that with the arrival of knights into Ireland and the massive changes into warfare?
Agree with what you said, but just to add on, one example, William Marshall.
Yeah.
I actually made a video about it. I visited Temple Church last year, and he's there. His son is, etc. And and then the importance of William Marshall for Magna Carta, etc. But I was walking around and I said, hold on a second, William Marshall, or definitely his son, could play for Ireland. Because William Marshall married the daughter of Strongbow. In other words, the daughter of Strongbow and Aoife, who also happens to be the granddaughter of Dermot McMurrough. So you're talking about interactions between the different groups, and you have this guy who's taken as the epitome of English chivalry, and like most of his lands are actually in Ireland. His wife is Irish. His children, as I say, camp for Ireland.
Have you read up on the King John's invasion of Ireland? I can't remember. I think it's around 1220. It could be earlier. But in King John's invasion of Ireland, Isabel de Clare and William Marshall are fighting against King John. I know they are allied with the Plantagenets in the First Barons' War, but when King John invades Ireland, he besieges Kilkenny. The siege of Trim is just a complete and utter disaster. But he sieges Carrickfergus. Like, King John is fighting against what many people refer to at the time as Hiberno Normans. So when you turn around and say, oh, William Marshall could have fought on the team. Yeah, 100%. William Marshall was on Team Ireland, and at the time, which is even more wild, Hugh de Lacy had married into the O'Connor family at that point, and also the de Burghs had also married into the O'Briens. So like it's much more complicated than people think, especially by the time you get up to 1220. These Norman barons in Ireland, or old French barons, had their own, plans.
Yeah, yeah. And there's another point about effigies.
Mm,
Effigies are a very interesting historical source. Except I always say you have to be somewhat skeptical
yeah.
because the you're paying someone to make an effigy of you. It's probably
Mm,
not cheap,
yeah.
and like they're not going to put you lying in your armor that you've been used and is probably a little battered,
Mm,
and it could well be like 50 years out of date. They're going
mm,
to, put you in nice armor. And if the mason happened to be someone who'd recently been in England and
mm,
seen the armor there, he would have put a bit of that in. So effigies are an interesting source, but I was a bit difficult to
mm,
use them as a source for saying everybody was using this armor. I think there would have been armor going around. Uh, Most people, like knights with suits of armor, I'm sure parts were nice and shiny and new.
mm,
Other parts, perhaps on the back, were a bit battered and tarnished. And that was
mm,
at the beginning of a campaign. When you're coming back from, say, you were campaigning around Ireland for 3 months with King John or 6 months, I'm
mm.
sure you had no shiny armor left, and you probably lost lots of bits and pieces of the armor here and there in bogs, etc.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um,
I just
Go on there.
no, just what we're talking about. This is slightly more in the future of our talk, but I'll just answer anyway. To Michael says he's read about the massacre of camp followers by Oliver Cromwell at Clonmel. That never happened. The only example I can think of any massacre of camp followers or Irish camp followers is Battle of Naseby, but
Mm,
they were mistaken as Irish. They were actually Welsh camp followers. 100 or so camp followers were massacred. The parliamentarians thought they were Irish and killed them. Um, then Wexford is another one where I believe the town folk are said to have assembled in the town square by a big cross, and
mm,
they were still massacred there. Um, uh, and Drogheda, the burning of the church as well, where civilians were killed. But neither of them are camp followers, and actually, by and large, they would probably be the only examples anyway, because Cromwell's campaign was rather, apart from those exceptions, was rather quite civilized in terms of warfare at the time. Um, when you compare it to continental Europe, especially. So, uh, yeah, so I don't know if his Clonmel, I believe he honoured the fact that he'd been tricked and come to terms with the O'Neill, but he'd left. And he still honoured the treaty, even though the Irish had snuck out the night before. Um, so, yeah, unless, Owen, you can think of any camp followers
In
being
Cromwellian
massacred.
times, I don't know that much, but I know there were huge massacres of camp followers and civilians in the 9 Years' War.
mm,
It was policy. You were like the Elizabethans. The Elizabethans get away with a lot, um, and they like they killed everybody. They didn't believe in civil rights or prisoners. If they didn't kill you, they'd execute you fairly soon afterwards.
mm. Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people have this idea that no, I'm not turning around saying Cromwell's conquest of Ireland was a nice parade. But at the same time, I think you've pointed out this before, Owen, is the fact that the Tudor conquest was a lot more bloodier and violent than Cromwell's conquest of Ireland.
Yeah, it was longer. It went on. It
Mm,
involved much more wars. Um, I'm not a fan of Cromwell, but I know that Michal has said before. Oh my God, getting the name. Cromwell, I think stayed in Ireland 9 months. His
Yeah.
army stayed in Ireland probably 3 years, and there were quite a few atrocities carried out afterwards.
Mm,
Like I know just one at the Battle of, I never know how to pronounce it, Scarfolis. It's
Mm.
a very significant defeat that's never talked about. It was basically Owen Rua O'Neill's army after he died. For
mm,
some reason, a bishop called Eber MacMahon was put in command, and in this, his army had, I think they were on top of a hill, so they were in a good
mm,
side. And he moved to the bottom of the hill, and the Cromwellians said, "Thanks a million," and routed them. And one of, I think, Owen O'Neill's son, who should have been put in charge,
mm,
was surrendered, like he was promised pardon. But then whoever the Cromwellian commander was, maybe it was Coote, turned around
mm.
and said, "Oh, sorry, I've changed my mind," and executed him. Um, and
Lovely.
Yeah.
there were brutal things.
Yeah. Just
Especially when the campaign is winding up and is heading into sort of more irregular warfare, which always
Mm.
results. James O'Neill has pointed that out in one of his papers on the 9 Years' War, that when you have irregular warfare, atrocities seem to
Mm.
get worse.
Yeah.
yeah. I just gonna nip in and just say it was the individual you were asked you'd mentioned is Henry Ireton. It's Cromwell's son-in-law.
That's it. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm.
We need that Cromwell video, Michael. Yeah, when my phone's fixed, but it's going to cost me over 100 quid and to get it fixed because I'm not rewriting that script. I'm not rewriting it. I
Ah,
spent months on that, and so I refuse to write. So it's on a phone which is here broken. When I get it fixed,
lovely.
So
I'll do the video.
Oh my god. I'm waking up too early for these bloody live streams and stuff. What was it called? My brain now is turning on again. But it's interesting how warfare does change going from the 13th century, which has the classic crusader feel to it. Because by the time we get up to the Scottish War of Independence around 1280, you have the return of Edward I from the Crusades, the last crusade that happens in the 9th century, back to England. And from there, we have the start of the Scottish War of Independence. Now, granted, the official end of the Crusades in Jerusalem doesn't end until around 1310, where we have the gathering up of all the Knights Crusaders to be burned at the stake because of heresy, allegedly. But it's at that point onwards, when we go into the Scottish War of Independence, that warfare gets more complicated. Just before then, in up around the modern day Netherlands and those regions around there, the French tried to occupy the modern day Netherlands and tried to take control of the wool market there. The Frisians are able to defend themselves using pike formation, which completely advances warfare from that point onwards. People have a very romanticized idea that guns ended the cavalry formations. It's a bit more complicated than that. And you can see that going into the late medieval period, not just in the continent between Frisian pikemen and French cavalry, but also in Britain as well, with the arrival of Scottish pikemen and also the usage of Gaelic hobblers. Gaelic hobblers were quite interesting because you couldn't have a cavalry charge into hobblers because the English knights would easily wreck them up. But hobblers were very good at harassing both cavalrymen and the formations of people. But used with pikemen, they were very devastating because of the fact that people would charge into pike formations And just as they're losing against pike formations, or maybe the pike formations were starting to get overwhelmed, Hoblo horsemen would quickly, from both Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland, and also the Border Reivers, would quickly go in and flank the formations of infantry and also cavalrymen as well that were pinned down by pike formations, complicating Gaelic warfare and also lowland warfare in both Scotland and Ireland going into the start of the Scottish War of Independence. Is there anything else of note that you guys would love to highlight going into the start of the 14th century in both Ireland and Scotland and the massive changes in warfare as cavalry warfare in Ireland definitely does start to get much more complicated?
Well, one point to talk about is landscape. Where are you fighting? Because in
Yeah, that's a
Ireland,
huge
there's a
deal.
lot of forest, a lot of bog,
Mm,
and a lot of hills and drumlins.
mm,
In If you actually look at where the Norman lordships are formed, most of that is on the best land in Ireland.
yeah.
Kildare, the Curragh of Kildare, Meath, um, the parts of Cork, parts of Limerick, where essentially the Golden Vale. The
Mm,
Berks are a bit different because I don't know Northern Connacht well, but I
yeah.
don't think it's particularly flat. Um, Parts of Ulster, I think you have flat land, but not much. So
Mm,
they capture the best land fairly quickly, and then build castles, etc., which is another important part of their warfare. But
mm,
then you know they're going to be fighting, um, often with Gaelic soldiers on both sides, and sometimes with Norman from on both sides, and
mm,
going to be often in more skirmishes, often on territory that's not good for cavalry charges. Because if you
mm,
take a big horse on plonk, a knight in full armor on it, and get him to charge into what is a bog, you're going to have
mm.
something very interesting happening.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it won't be positive. The knight won't enjoy that interesting discovery.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about the yawn there. And what's interesting as well is even before we get into the Scottish War of Independence, we go into the era of Brian O'Neill's revolt and the Tamad Wars in Ireland. And in that period, we have the likes of marriage alliances between the old, not was it the O'Neill, was it the O'Connors and the oh God, you can correct me on this one, Mihal, that Gallo Glass marriage alliance between the O'Connors and who was it? The McRorys, isn't it? It's the McRorys. They
Yeah,
marry into the
yeah,
McRorys that bring in the Gallo Glass.
yeah.
And the Gallo Glass reintroduce conventional warfare. Was a kind of Norwegian Gaelic warfare back into Ireland again. What had happened with the arrival of the Normans into Ireland is that the Normans, the old French lords, were very, very quick to capture the ports of Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Galway. And that restricts the trade coming into Ireland, in particular, weapons and armour, right? However, with these marriages, and this is me going into an interesting theory, is that with those marriage alliances, it kind of rekindles those trade routes from Norway and Scotland into Ireland once again, especially when it comes down to conventional warfare. And the arrival, the fresh arrival of Gallo Glass, Gall Oglach, if I'm pronouncing it right, on correct me there, into Ireland once again, which would have replaced the earlier Gall Gael, the foreign Irish, that had previously done a lot of the conventional warfare in Ireland. When I say conventional warfare, I mean holding those formations. Because once those Normans have cut off a lot of those key ports, it's very, because they don't have the armor and weapons to do so, it appears that it becomes more and more difficult for the Irish to hold ground. But with the reintroduction of conventional war bands with the correct riveted mail, the correct helmets, the correct weapons such as spears, axes, etc., that being reintroduced with the gallo glass, the Irish are able to once again go out there and start butchering the Normans up close, especially as you said there, these Normans getting stuck into the boggy lands up in the north, west of the areas of Ireland, and the gallo glass being able to completely expand, take advantage of that situation and bring fear to these Norman knights in Ireland.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just replying to another thing there, but yeah, I mean, but we see it go the other way too. There are soldiers in the 1300s who are Anya O'Cahan marries into McDonald's and sends over 140 soldiers with her dowry. So this dowry of this payment of dowry of troops isn't unusual, but certainly whenever the gallo glass come into Ireland, it changes warfare. Although it's been sort of mythologized that the Irish were getting slaughtered left, right, and center by the Anglo-Normans in battle. Although initially the Norman war machine was a surprise to probably many who hadn't gone to fight in campaigns outside of Ireland, or hadn't heard the news of this Norman war machine reaching from Sicily, the Middle East to Ireland, now on the Ireland shores. There are obviously evidence. There are battles that the Irish were winning before the.
That's a fact. Like I always point out that the Norman invasion of Ireland is more of the conclusion with the Treaty of Windsor is more of a stalemate than a victory for either the Normans nor the Irish, and it kind of bumps into the stalemate after the battle, which we completely ignore, by the way, and Owen has highlighted many times, is the Battle of Thurles in 1174, and also the siege of Limerick that happens around 1175 to 1176, which ends with the Treaty of Windsor. So in my opinion, the Norman invasion of Ireland ends in more of a stalemate rather than a conclusion with a conquest, in my opinion.
Yeah, because like the Battle of Callan is 100 years later, 1260, 1261.
Yeah.
Although you can argue about it, it's the Fitzgeralds who are about to become the oh my God, my brain tonight is not working. They're about to set up the lordship down in Munster. They get defeated trying to break into the McCarthy Moor, what has become the McCarthy Moor heartland. Probably because they're advancing through hilly, forested territory. The landscape doesn't suit them. So the energy and the wave, the Norman Blitzkrieg in a way, runs out of energy. Brian O'Neill's rebellion is defeated, though there's Gaelic Irish fighting on both sides. Then you have other things. You have constant infighting among the Normans. You have constant infighting and civil wars in England. It gets very hard to, like, there's so much conflict in England. You kind of literally have to write down year by year, and it's hard to keep. The Irish history is much more simple. Then gallo glasses start coming in. Like Micheál, I think they do change the thing a lot, but they are very mythologized. There's loads of videos on talking about gallo glass as being almost a regular military unit. Everyone wearing this uniform, everyone using an axe. When in reality, there would have been something much more flexible and much more different. And again, like when they come, when you employ them on day one, they're all bright and shiny. 6 months later, you know, they might several would be dead, others would have been replaced, weapons would have been broken. So you have
Mm.
like you, they are men. They weren't supermen. They did have an
Yeah,
impact.
that's
So
a
did
fact.
many other factors.
But
Hmm.
these were war. You
Um,
see, this is the thing: is that people assume that the Gallo glass that came to Ireland in the 13th century is the same Gallo glass. They completely, if you look at the effigies, you can see how they change over time. Like the effigies that you see on Iona of depictions of the men of the Isles, which were the Gallo glass of the 13th century, look completely different to the Gallo glass going into the 15th century. So you're bang on right when you say that the Gallo glass, the same Gallo glass that went into Ireland in the early 13th, sorry, well, mid 13th century, around 1250, um, are different and do change because of battles and warfare, so on and so forth. Yeah, bang on right. You could see that with the effigies, even the way that they're forced to adapt, even their helmets change and have to change because of the change of warfare and the change of weapons that are brought into Ireland. Because after 1250 onwards, Ireland is between the Scottish Scandinavian world and its development that's happening there, especially with the massive advancements in warfare that's happening in Scotland. And also, it's sandwiched between the warfare that's happening in the Iberian Peninsula and France, that's also influencing the south east of the island of Ireland, which is
Another
connected by its ports into those areas.
another thing is Scottish history, as or Lord of the Isles
Mm,
history. I know that Hiram Morgan points out that I think it was at the collapse of the Lord of the Isles and later the the MacDonald's losing results in
mm,
lots of soldiers who would otherwise have been involved in fighting in Scotland in the Isles coming over to Ulster, which O'Neills and O'Donnells, as they were the richest and most powerful. It suddenly they got even more richer and more powerful because they were able to recruit hundreds, if not a couple of thousand more men.
mm,
At a time when the English military force in Ireland was shrinking, you had the Black Death, you had wars with France, etc.
yeah,
The English attention was turning away from Ireland, and it was
yeah,
presumed that the English in Ireland would defend the state they had built. And then all
mm,
of a sudden, the several Gaelic Irish lords uh, suddenly find that they can recruit fairly easily a large amount of good soldiers.
mm. Jesus, that collapse of the lordship of the Isles that happens in 1493. God, that's just in time for the Gaelic resurgence and the
Yeah,
campaigns of Art MacMor Cavanagh. And sorry, the later, sorry, no, not the Art MacMor Cavanagh. That's just in time for the Wars of the Roses in Ireland. And just before all that stuff really kicks off, that's the peak of the O'Donnells. So that's really good timing for the Irish. Jesus, no wonder.
yeah. So, like, if the the lordship of the Isles hadn't collapsed, if it had
Mm,
stood stronger, and there was much more fighting between Edinburgh and
yeah.
whatever the capital of Lord of the Isles was, I don't know what island was their main force. If if that had turned into a war of the roses up there, uh, it would have resulted in a significantly weaker Ireland or Gaelic Ireland.
Mm. God, that's fascinating. I actually have to keep a note of that one. Because I never thought of actually sitting down and actually studying the collapse of the Lordship of the Isles. I know they're exceptionally important when it comes down to the movement of the Gallo Glass going between Scotland and Ireland, but I never thought about actually sitting down and studying the collapse. And I would have assumed the collapse would have been a negative thing, but as you highlighted there, because then you have this large bulk of military force then going into Ireland, um, yeah, it does change warfare completely, especially going into the Wars of the Roses in Ireland, because I think the Wars of the Roses in Ireland was coming to its conclusion from that point onwards. It's very funny how the O'Neills and the O'Donnells didn't play a huge part in the Battle of Stokefield. It was mostly a Fitzgerald battle against the Tudors. Maybe if we had that large military force of Gallowglass going into the Battle of Stokefield, definitely would have changed history permanently. Which kind of brings us on to the conversation of the 15th century, and the changes and adapting that's happening there, because the two major parts of that is the earlier campaigns that are happening in France with the Hundred Years' War, which it's kind of a funny one because we have the fact of these raising of these kind of Anglo-Irish forces, especially with the Butlers in was it Kilkenny, which were raising these military forces and bringing them over to France. And then halfway into the Hundred Years' War, we have warfare changing again when it breaks into the Gaelic resurgence, which was led by Art MacMore Cavanagh, and sees like it can become very romanticized very, very quickly, because you kind of have this idea of Gaelic Art MacMore Cavanagh and him on his hoblo horse, riveted mail, throwing javelins. Somebody asked early on what was the impact of javelins and darts in Ireland. Javelin and darts in Ireland, because Ireland and its woodland was so dense, was massively effective. Now, granted, the javelin men and the darts did have a disadvantage in big open fields, fighting against Richard II's longbowmen. But once again, once you get into that dense forestry with very boggy lands that was very difficult for the English to navigate around, the English are losing very important battles against the Irish, especially up in the Wicklow Mountains, where the land is massively difficult for people, especially wearing shoes and stuff, which gives Art MacMore Cavanagh a huge advantage. For warfare during the Hundred Years' War, is there anything you guys would love to expand on and have a conversation with right now?
I just wanted to just about the javelin,
Mm,
the dart. 2 points. One, yeah, it might have been effective, but it's more an individual
mm,
uh, thing, like sort of for harassment. You're on the horse and you throw it and gallop off. You, the word, it's nothing like the longbow, where you
yeah,
have well-trained men, like 100 of them could produce a massive volley.
yeah.
Javelins were more for individual fighting, and secondly, in the I think it's in the life of Baha Adrian O'Donnell,
Mm,
there is an interesting claim to a two-headed javelin,
yeah.
injuring one of the top English lords there, which I find I've
Mm.
never seen a picture of it. But of a javelin with two heads, sort of like a mini trident. So I always found that interesting.
Mm. Yeah, it is very fascinating. All right, because you can see that, just to back up what you were saying there, because you can see that with Richard II's invasion of Ireland that happens around 1395 up to 1399. At the very start of those campaigns, Richard II is very, very successful, and especially the Kerns, the cattle raiders, have an absolute nightmare dealing with English longbowmen, especially out in open field. Like if they're out in open field, the Kerns are wiped out of it. However, when you go into the dense forests, and they do, the English do that to follow, to chase after the Kerns, the tables completely flip. The Kerns have then massive advantages against the English longbowmen, where they're, as you said, they're not able to use these volley shots in dense forestry to go against the Kerns. And it's from that point that the darts and javelins definitely seem to start penetrating into English armour once again. What's also interesting about the development of warfare going into the 14th century is in the 13th century, riveted mail had dominated warfare inside of Western Europe. However, as we go into the 14th century, it's at that point onwards that we start to see this kind of medieval punkish era where plate armor is starting to develop because of massive, huge scale conventional warfare that was happening in France at the time, that the Irish were a part of because of the raising of forces, especially with the Butlers, raising of I was it Anglo-Irish forces in Kilkenny and going off to France to fight against the French. So with that, even in Ireland, you see a massive change in development happening. So by the time you get into the 15th century and you're dealing with the later Hundred Years' War and the Wars of the Roses in Ireland, um, Irish armour from that point onwards completely develops separately from English armour and is more adjusted to cattle raiding inside of Ireland. You can definitely see that not just with effigies that are found all over Ireland that shows Ridra. Like if you were to type in Ridra Irish Knight, you're going to see Irish armour, which is completely different to the development of English armour and was more organised for the rough, tough terrain, more organized for ambushes, far better at dueling at, and also was primarily around cattle raiding because at this point, Owen and Neil can disagree with this part and so can Mihal, and that is the term more Irish than the Irish themselves. But where there is smoke, there is always fire. And you can see the likes of the Bergs, the Butlers, and the Fitzgeralds taking part in cattle raids inside of Ireland, which has, changed the style of warfare that they're a part of and the evolution of their armor compared to their continent counterparts, which armor reflects more conventional, massive battle scale warfare.
No, I don't disagree.
Do you have anything? What's that?
He says, no, I don't disagree.
Yeah,
I concur.
like in a way, because like the 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 lords, the elites are intermarrying, but you need soldiers, and they're not going to get waves upon waves of new settlers. They're
Yeah.
they're they're starting to their lordships cover lots of Gaelic areas, like the Fitzpatrick were getting like under like Butler, under Desmond and the Kildare. They have loads of Gaelic minor lords. So and not every to wage war is complicated. To wage war is expensive, whereas to send
Yeah.
20, 30 guys on a cattle raid can actually be profitable. So like it makes sense. Someone just Jim just asked, did catapults exist in medieval Ireland? Um, there are like in the 9 Years' War, there's records of both sides building not catapults but machinery to besiege, like sows and stuff like that. Probably some catapults were used, but not that much because building a big catapult is complicated. Battering rams, etc., would have been more common.
Yeah, it's wild. We are ram mad, aren't we? Go on.
No, I did read some, and I have to go back to this, but I'm pretty sure Henry II brought some siege warfare as a show of strength as he was going around Ireland.
See, this is what's complicated is that the fact that if you look at Irish tower castles in Ireland in the 15th century, those Irish tower castles, they're not like people. I get into a lot of arguments and debates about this, but people are assuming Irish tower castles are something that's very primitive ring forts. It's not. Type in Bunratty Castle, for example, which was constructed by the O'Brien. Well, it was constructed by the MacMorras, and the O'Briens had lived in it for quite some time. And also Blarney Castle, which is owned by the McCartys, and you will suddenly be shocked by the standard of castles there in Ireland at the time. However, because the entrances and exits were so kind of concentrated, you had to use rams to try to penetrate through. So rams were, and this isn't just in Ireland; it's the same thing in Europe as well. Trebuchets, a lot of the time, even in Europe, trebuchets were not penetrating through. We do have examples of extraordinary trebuchets being built by the likes of Edward the First, but most of the time, trebuchets were not penetrating castles in the 14th and 15th century. It's not until we get to the late 15th century. In Ireland, it's very much debated, did Lionel of Antwerp in the 14th century, did Lionel of Antwerp bring cannons to Ireland? But even if he did bring cannons to Ireland, cannons were very, very primitive in the 14th century. And so rams were way more effective over trebuchets and cannons in the 14th century. So that would have been the era of Art MacMore Cavenant. So you see these absolutely wonderful castles, but ultimately they have to overwhelm these castles and use rams to battle through, to smash through the doors, because these are big, refortified stone castles, very difficult to penetrate through, not just in Ireland, but in Europe as well. However, going into the late 15th century with the Wars of the Roses, we're starting to see cannons becoming more and more popular around the southeast of the island of Ireland. So we're starting to see them, but not truly penetrating in. It's not until like Owen O'Neill is literally the master there. When we do finally start to see castles start to get smashed, is the period of the 9 Years' War. So we can easily go into that there. How do cannons affect castles?
Before the siege of Maynooth. I think that was the first big, that was during Silken Thomas's rebellion. So in the 1540s, that was the first bit of a siege train as such. And Maynooth Castle fell fairly easy.
Yeah.
We've actually just about run out of time. It went very quickly.
Yeah. Hang on. Sort of like. Yeah. It's 3 minutes to go. So.
Yeah, I'll just answer that question there.
Yes.
I'm
I was
guessing
going to say that seems
crossbows
like a
were.
question.
Yeah. Was used in castle defenses in close encounterment. Yeah, Blarney, unless Owen wants to correct me on this one. From what I've been reading and talking about down in Blarney and Burnett castles, the windows were specifically designed for the firing of crossbows. We can use. There is a lot of evidence in the Wars of the Roses. The late 100 Years' War in the 15th century, and of the Wars of the Roses, that in the southeast of the island of Ireland, the crossbow was very effective, not just for the defense of castles, but also during sieging as well. They would reintroduce those Roman shields. The big massive ones are slightly bastionized, but the big massive shields were reintroduced into warfare and allegedly brought over to Ireland as well. For siege warfare, not for skirmish fighting, not for battles, but for siege warfare. And what you would do is you put down a big, massive shield, and then you would plonk a crossbow on it, and you would fire off the crossbow. And as that's being fired off, you'd have someone behind you. What was it called? Setting up a fresh, reloading the crossbow, because these things, the reason why they were in Ireland, they were not using them in battles and were not using them in skirmishes, is because they took too much time. Look, it took a team to work as a crossbow man. So you'd have three people. You'd have one setting up the crossbow, you'd have one for defense, and another person then firing off the crossbow at the castle. The reason why you'd have another person in defense is in case they were suddenly rushed. You'd have a guy with a spear to try to defend them against cavalry charges. So you'd have a team of crossbow, and then in top of that, they would work as an entire battalion of crossbow firing at once into, well, sometimes as a volley into the castle, hoping one of them would get through and into the window, and another crossbow firing as well. So in the southeast of Ireland, uh, allegedly you'd have crossbowmen inside of the, and you can see that anytime you're inside of a castle, just look at the thinness of the windows, which is a good indication of the usage of crossbows. So yeah, in the 15th century, in the late Hundred Years' War, and the Wars of the Roses in Ireland, there's definitely the usage of crossbow. And I assume then once we get into the 16th century, that then changes from crossbowmen into the more usage of guns, especially
Yeah,
going into the Nine Years' War.
I just said, like, yeah, 16th century crossbow disappears. And
Mm,
when you're talking about castles there, I would qualify it to say the larger castles held by Anglo-Norman lords.
mm,
There's loads and loads and loads of smaller tower houses,
yeah,
especially built by Gaelic lords. Most of them wouldn't have had uh, crossbows. And yeah,
yeah.
as during the 16th century, guns would become more and more common, and archers.
There's
Mm,
a ballad, the walling of New Ross, when the town was walled. Now obviously the numbers are going to be conflated because it's a bit of a like show of strength and a bit of a bit of propaganda, but it mentions like they basically turn around and say we've got 400 crossbowmen, over 1,000 archers, and like 3,000 spearmen. I'm
mm,
pretty sure the crossbows they mentioned is like somewhere near 400. So,
yeah.
and this is in like 12 in the 1260s, early 1260s. So,
Mm,
that we have references not only of just like the buildings and stuff. We have literal references of crossbows being mentioned in Ireland,
mm,
early. So,
for sure.
and that brings
We'll
us to
start finishing up.
2021.
So what?
So
What's that?
that brings us to 1 minute past.
Oh,
So,
I'll start finishing
yeah.
up. So, and I'll get back into bed now because it's still in the middle of the night here. I've been up since 4 a.m. setting up for this over in Japan. So I'll start finishing up and I'll get back into my bed. But yeah, thanks very much, lads, for all the support. Tomorrow, I'm doing a discussion, a PowerPoint presentation over my Patreon on William Wallace. So if you're interested in that, definitely head on over to my Patreon at Irish Medieval History, where I do presentations. I'll be doing presentations for this month and next month. It's about 20 quid a month. So definitely head on over to Irish Medieval History and check that out. Mihal, Owen, what's the plans for this week? What are you guys up to?
Do you
Well,
want to go
I'm
first, Sean?
working on the Battle of Kinsale video.
Mm,
I'm working on the script. It's like, wait, what I've written so far is, I think it's like 20,000 words, so a few hours long, so it's a bit too long. So hopefully
mm,
at the
mm,
end
mm.
of the week I'll get out. I've been bringing out a few shorts, which are doing okay. So if anyone
Yeah.
wants to pop over to First Pass, have a look at my videos, like, subscribe, and then if you feel like making a contribution to buy me a coffee account, it's always
Mm,
there. It's buy me a coffee / First Pass.
mm. Happy days. And Mihal, any plans for the week, or have you just completely given up on all of it?
No, I've posted every day on Facebook. So, if you need a bit of history reading, go to Facebook. I'm just basically I have about 4 years worth of notes on my phone.
Mm,
Well, I didn't get them all back from when my phone broke last year, but I got a lot of them still that I've just decided to start. They're not specifically family related. But I try to incorporate families within them. So if you need a bit of light reading, check the Facebook out. Shorts, I'm flipping a coin, which family next video is going to be, because I've been looking at two families, but it's going to be two Ulster families anyway. But it looks a bit McDunleavy's or the O'Neills,
mm,
and apart from that, unfortunately, I don't know. I've still got a few videos in the pipeline, but I'm so concentrating on writing this book. It might absorb all my energy. So just just bear with that. But just like as always, like, follow, subscribe, comment on the videos, and feel free to become a member. Got the live this Wednesday for my members, so feel free to come and
Happy
check it out.
days.
Thanks very much.
Other than that, guys, thanks very much, and slán go bhfuil. See you guys. Bye.
Slán.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Slán.